We have this fear of like, well, I'm going to produce less if I'm not at full intensity all the time. But the reality is that quality becomes this key engine to slow productivity.
If you actually want to be productive, this is a guide on how to do that.
Dr. Cal Newport, professor and the author, Slow Productivity, The Lost Art of Accomplishment.
When you obsess over quality, one of the side effects that becomes unavoidable is you have to slow down. If you're doing too much, you can't do anything.
Betting on yourself and obsessing over quality. It's not a hack.
Stuff begins to be finished at a higher level of quality. You're going to hit your marks better. You're going to gain more leverage in your career, but just give yourself time.
Cal, man, it's so great to have you back on the Learning Leader Show. Welcome.
Wow, it's good to be back. Let me tell you that this is a true story. Yesterday, I was wearing a vintage Learning Leader podcast t-shirt.
Really? Okay.
I mean, from early days, I think one of my early appearances on your show, we're talking many years ago, you sent me a shirt. I still have it. I like it. It's gray. And it has Learning Leader in black. I don't know if you know what I'm talking about.
I do. It's the old school logo that I had made like on Fiverr for $6, dude. So like, I got to send you the updated gear.
Oh, I'm representing. I don't know why I like that shirt so much. I just do. It fits well. It's comfortable. Anyways, I had it on the other day, and then I was like, wait, I'm talking to Ryan tomorrow. Look at this. This is the universe saying, we're ready for some Learning Leader.
Okay. Did not know you're going to say this, but you write about obsessing over quality. Okay, Cal. And one of the things that's important if you're going to make merch, obsess over the feel of the t-shirt so that a guy like Cal Newport wants to continue wearing it, I don't know, 7 years later or however long it's been since I originally sent you that. So obsess over quality. That's key 3 in Slow Productivity, your latest book, man. That's something I really try to aspire to.
I should have used you as an example because I have another shirt. I won't mention names. A really good friend of mine, author friend of mine, sent me a shirt, and the fabric, you can kind of see your skin through it. You know what I mean? Like you can sort of get it's a white shirt. I was like, nah, see, it matters, right?
You got to obsess over the quality, man. I'm real big on that. Either it's funny, I have an event coming up and we're like figuring out what to give to some of the people coming to the event. And I have somebody helping with this and she's sending me these options. I'm like, well, it's either go for the very top line, or we're not doing anything when it comes to whatever that particular thing is. And I think there's something to be said to that for how you live. And I'm curious, again, way not where I thought we were going to start, but let's just do it anyway. When you think about obsessing over quality, and maybe this is some of the Derek Sivers, hell yeah or no, and I'm not sure if I fully believe in that with everything in life, but how do you apply this obsess over quality into your personal and professional life?
Well, I mean, in the end, especially if what you're doing is entrepreneurial, especially if what you're doing, you're a freelance, you're a solopreneur, you run your own shop. In the end, what matters is the quality of what you produce, right? I mean, ultimately, that's the thing, not just that makes money, but it's the thing that gives you the freedom to dictate how you want your professional life to unfold, right? It's the things that gives you that leverage. The better you are at something, the more control you have over your professional life and the more opportunity you'll have to slow down, right? The escape busyness, to escape overload. Like quality is the way to get out of that. And then on the flip side, we're just wired for it, right? Humans are wired to feel good when we do something well. We have this drive to not just do things well, but that recognition that this thing is great is one of the more long-lasting positive sensations that humans psychologically feel. It's because we're wired to actually try to get better, to produce stuff, to master. So, I really think making craft and quality at the center of how you think about your work, especially if you have a lot of autonomy, is the recipe for like a much more meaningful professional life.
In this portion of your book, Slow Productivity, when you're writing about obsessing over quality, maybe these two musicians just piqued my curiosity because I'm fans of them. And I very vividly remember being a fan of Alanis Morissette when I was growing up. And you write about Jewel, the musician, as well as Alanis Morissette when it comes to betting on yourself and obsessing over quality. Can you share more about those two musicians and why you decided to write about them?
Well, Jewel's story is particularly interesting because it highlights the double-edged sword of advantage when it comes to obsessing over quality, right? So there's two different advantages you get from it, and her story shows both, right? So like the key thing I focused in on the book was really early Jewel. So she's in San Diego. She's living out of her car, but she's also this very talented musician because people don't know this about her, but she grew up in Alaska, rural Alaska, Homer, Alaska, but her family was traveling. They were traveling family musicians, right? So they would travel Alaska. She knew how to yodel. She was from Swiss heritage, so they had a yodeling part of their act, which actually gives you a lot of cool vocal control. She was plucked out of obscurity to go attend a really prestigious arts high school, essentially in Michigan, Interlochen. So she was trained and had all this talent, but ended up essentially wandering and was living out of her car. And she starts performing at this coffee house. It's kind of like her last ditch thing. She's like, "Let me just perform. We'll split the door. I just feel like my music's going to do something." And it did, right? And so they get this exponential growth thing happening as Jewel is playing at this coffee house in San Diego, living out of her car. It's, two surfers the first week. Then it's four, those two surfers and their two friends. And then it's eight, then it's 16. And like a 6 month period, they're overflowing this coffee house. They have to put speakers outside so you can sort of look through the window of the coffee house and still hear the performance going on because she has this super raw, interesting thing going on. So the record executives arrive like, okay, this is special. We want this. They start fighting over, flying her out, fighting over trying to get her to sign. And finally, one of the companies puts $1 million on the table, $1 million signing bonus. And she turns that down. She says, actually, don't give me that bonus. Sign me. I don't want the big bonus. Right. All right. So this is where I kind of pick up the story because here's what was going on is it's sort of the first advantage, I think, of such equality is shown in this story. The reason why she turned it down is she realized she wasn't ready yet to have a huge hit record, right? She'd been playing in this coffee house for 6 months, but she didn't have it together yet to have a huge hit record. But if she took $1 million signing bonus, they were going to expect her to make that back right away. Let's get that record out, biggest pop producers. And if they did it, they were going to drop her, right?
Yeah, they're not just giving it to you for fun. The expectation is coming. It's coming.
It's coming fast because now you're on the books, right? And that A&R guy who signs you is going to have to answer to the higher up. So she very savvily actually got more back end, which ended up making her a fortune. No signing bonus of any large size because she wanted to have time to learn how to do this better. And because they cost her no money, the fact that her first album, it struggled out of the gate. She wasn't really ready yet. She was right. When she was recording the album, she'd never played with a band before. And so now she's recording her first album. She's nervous. She had never played with a band before. That comes through in the music. She wasn't really ready to be on stage. She spent months just learning how to do this. Very cheap, no tour van, driving herself, her on stage, moving her own equipment, just performing, figuring out her voice, figuring out how to perform, goes back eventually, re-records what's going to become her big, huge first big single. Now she's more confident. She re-records it with Flea from the Red Hot Chili Peppers, who is a friend of hers. It has like a real groove to it. And then finally things take off, right? And that album, Pieces of Me, goes crazy and she makes a fortune off of it. But the lesson there, so the lesson that was highlighting is that when you obsess over quality, one of the side effects that becomes unavoidable is you have to slow down. Right. She had to slow down and say, no, I don't want the big record deal. Let's try to make this all happen at once. If I really care about doing this well, I have to take my time. And it's going to take me, I need to focus on this and just do this. So it's like this first advantage of obsession over quality is that it makes busyness just naturally seem anathema. Like we can't have this in our life. And then the quick second thing that happened, so she blows up, she gets very successful. She goes on this big tour. It's exhausting. She stars as a supporting role in an Ang Lee movie. And her people are like, great, this is the game plan. It's the Taylor Swift game plan. You're going to do international tours. You're going to move to LA. In between your international tours, you're going to do movies. And she thinks about this for a second, says, wait a second. I'm really good at music. I have a lot of money. I have a lot of fans. I don't want to do it. No. And she never did an international tour again, and she stopped doing movies. She's like, I'm just going to record specifically what I want to record. She moved out the ranch on Texas for a while. So it was the second observation about why obsessing over quality is valuable is that it gives you the leverage to dictate the terms of your life. And
Mm.
she did not want to be Taylor Swift. She didn't want to be on the road 350 days a year and be the biggest star in the world. She wanted to produce music that she liked and live and have fans and do it at her own pace. So quality forces you to slow down. Quality gives you the leverage to slow yourself down as well. So like quality becomes this key engine to slow productivity because it has this double-edged advantage to it.
And getting very clear, especially impressive at a young age that she was able to do this, getting very clear on what your definition of success is, because society will tell you what it should be. They will tell you what you should do. And I found, Cal, a commonality among leaders who sustain excellence over time is they are very clear on their definition of success, and they're okay with letting people down or even having them be upset with them because they're not willing to go by society's definition of success.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And also knowing even if your measure is the same as other people's. So Jewel might have said, I want to sell a lot of albums.
Yeah.
How you get there matters, right? And so realizing like getting there by doing something that's too good to be ignored, honing my craft until it really is something original, that's very different than, riding a wave. Let's get a big pop producer in here and have like a sort of grunge pop mix. Like there's a lot of bands like that in the 90s. I grew up in the 90s. That's why I have Jewel, Alanis, Morissette. I think a lot about that scene. If you think back to the 90s, there were a lot of these bands that were doing this sort of punk pop, sort of shallow, but like the videos were crazy, getting these sort of these bursts of attention and sales and then disappearing. Like, so it matters how you're chasing the success. Like, even if you want to sell books, there's a difference between I'm writing something that people just have to keep telling other people about for the next decade versus like we made a big thing and there's a huge publicity thing, or I'm notorious or infamous and people kind of wanted to hear about it. Yeah. So how you get there matters as well.
How do you juxtapose someone like Jewel with the ethos of early days at Facebook and Mark Zuckerberg, move fast and break things? Because I still feel like there's an obsession over quality, but I could be wrong. But both of them have ended up doing quite well. Okay, I guess we could say from Jewel and Zuckerberg's businesses, and his life seems like it's in a good spot right now.
Yeah.
Different ways to approach it, maybe, or at least that just seems like the ethos. But if you think about those two different styles, what are your thoughts?
Well, but underlying it, there's a commonality,
Yeah.
right? So like Zuckerberg was always focused like a laser beam on what mattered. So early on, it was user numbers.
Yeah.
This is what matters. We got to get user numbers up. Now, his strategy for how do we do this? Well, we have to write a new strategy rule book from scratch because Web 2 at this scale had never been done before. So we're going to have to try a lot of things, but we know exactly what we're trying to do. And then after the mobile revolution, his target changed from user numbers to engagement. So what is the average active user minutes is what matters, right? How do we get people to keep using this? And again, they experimented a lot, but they had their eye on this very specific prize. We want to do this. This number needs to go up, and they really were focused. I've actually heard reports from inside Meta now that there's some issues going on there now because they maintain the tactical strategy of let's just rock and roll, try things like entrepreneurial, right? But they're lacking that laser point target. And so there's a lot of inside Meta, a lot of activity going on, but it's not necessarily moving the boat in the same direction, right? Because they sort of lost that early day focus on this is what we're trying to do. Like this number needs to be, we want people to be more engaged. We want more users. So I'm going to make a strategy tactics differentiation there. The strategy is crystal clear. We want to do this as well as possible. It's Silicon Valley. The tactics might involve a lot of, we have to figure out how to do this. Where in music, now music's been around. There's no mystery. You need to produce really original, interesting music and be good at performing it, right? There's no experimentation that needs to be done to figure out what the tactic is there. It's just really hard to do it well.
It feels like I keep coming back when people ask me for advice. Usually at the end of keynotes, I mention your name all the time, yours and Steve Martin, right? And So Good They Can't Ignore You is one of the greatest book titles of all time. Comes from the Steve Martin quote when he was with Charlie Rose, and you write about that. And it feels there's a lot of so good they can't ignore you in a lot of what you do, especially when you talk about obsessing over quality. Now that we're revisiting you and I, how has your mind, whether it's evolved or changed, or maybe not at all, you're doubling down even more on this idea of being so good they can't ignore you?
I mean, I still think that's the number one advice for any creative endeavor, but also really any endeavor where you're producing something that you're trying to convince the world is valuable. Right? Your number one goal is to be good, get better at what you're doing. I still obsess about that. I'm going through that with, my writing right now. Like, it's all I think about in my writing is, how do I level up again? How do I become a better writer? How do I become more original in what I'm doing? What is the move to make that is unmissable, unmistakable, right? So I'm a huge believer, and of course that heavily influences this idea from the new book of obsessing over quality. You could trace that all the way back to Be So Good They Can't Ignore You, right? Because that idea was one of the most formative ideas when I was coming up. Encountering that in my mid 20s remains one of the most formative ideas. So being so good you can't be ignored is still remains, I think, the number one tactic for building a really cool life.
It's really hard, but you probably now, as a podcaster, as a writer, get a lot of questions about publishing books, about making a podcast, about all this. And there's a lot of these questions about hacks and about how to get it to grow and how to get people to be aware of it. Have you focused on making the podcast so good that it can't be ignored? That's like the number one question before the hacks or the marketing or the social media strategy. It's like, have you listened to the actual podcast? And is it so good that it can't be ignored? That trumps everything else. And yet it seems like it's not the top of the list for people who are making these things, at least the ones that are asking me questions. I try to respond with that every time, but it's not really the most enjoyable answer to receive because it's hard. It's not crystal clear. It's not a hack. It's just what ends up differentiating you from everybody else.
Well, I mean, I get this a lot when it comes to social media, right? Because I don't use social media, so people are always asking me. I have a podcast. I have a book that's coming out or what have you. I have art. How am I going to find an audience without social media? And I always come back to, like, well, look, I mean, if you want to use social media to help promote something, like, I'm not going to yell at you. It's fine, but it's not the thing that's going to make your audience grow. It's producing something that's awesome.
Yes.
And if it's awesome, people will find it and it will spread. And if it's not, they won't. And everything else is just like the details of how that unfolds or where it unfolds. And it's not so interesting. Like, if you produce something awesome and you're a heavy TikTok user, then okay, people will talk about it a lot on TikTok. If you produce that same awesome thing and you don't use TikTok, but you're a really big on podcast, and okay, then the podcast will spread, it will find its way. But here's the irony. The book I wrote about this concept, So Good They Can't Ignore You, came out in 2012. I wrote that book. I was like, this is a good book. This is an original idea. I think this is important. When that book came out, it didn't do well. Right?
It didn't initially do well?
Did not initially do well. So that book comes out in 2012. It's a hard book to get your arms around. And also, it's not like I was a brand name, right? So then I pitched Deep Work, was the next book I wrote next. They reduced my advance for Deep Work versus what they gave me for So Good. It's like, well, So Good, it didn't really click. Fast forward now, we're more than a decade later. So Good They Can't Ignore You has sold hundreds of thousands of copies. It found its audience.
Yeah.
Out the gate, people didn't know who I was. There wasn't a lot of publicity around it. It's like, what's going on here? But it was good. And I knew it was good. And I remember telling my agent, my public, I'm like, this is a good book. Trust me. Like, this thing is going to spread. And for years, I did podcasts like yours. I would just talk about it. And over years, people would hear about it. They'd tell other people about it. And now it's, 300,000 or 400,000 copy selling book, never been on a bestseller list, never been, featured in some mates, just, it was too good to be ignored. So it's interesting. The book itself is a case study of I did none of the things you would need to do to spread the word about a book, and the book came out slow and no strategy. And yet it still found, that thing, it found its audience, So it's an example of it itself is an example of what it talks about.
Obsess over quality, man. Usually you're going to find a way. I was surprised to read a little bit about, in your most recent book, Benjamin Franklin, because you're talking about slow productivity, slowing down. And that's not the first phrase I would think of when I think of Benjamin Franklin. How did Benjamin Franklin exemplify the qualities of someone who believes in slow productivity?
Well, one of the other big ideas of slow productivity is if you're doing too much, you can't do anything.
Mm-hmm.
So if you have a lot of different things going on, you get a logjam effect where the logs going down the river, if there's too many of them, they get stuck in each other and you create a logjam and nothing gets down the river anymore, right? So we often think, do more things, you have more opportunities, more things will get done. But actually you have this inverse effect where the things begin to interfere with each other and very little gets done. This is the Franklin story. So like Franklin is a very successful entrepreneur. When he's coming up, he's a very successful printer and he's good and he hustles and he figures out that industry and he begins franchising and he has print shops in different cities and he's making a lot of money at this, but he's frustrated because he also has these other things he wants to work on things of great importance long term, ideas, science, philosophy, and he has all of this stuff going on trying to run all these businesses. So what he does, and this is like a forgotten part of the Franklin story, is he hires someone called David Hall to be an assistant. And like originally the idea was David Hall came over from England. He was just going to open one of Franklin's multiple franchises. He was going to send him down to the Carolinas to open a franchise. But Hall got sick on the ship ride over on the Atlantic, and they kind of put that plan on hold. So Hall was just sort of hanging around at Franklin's shop in Philadelphia. And Franklin's like, you know what? This guy's really competent. Here's what I'm going to do. He's going to take over all the day-to-day of all my businesses. And I am going to give him half of the profits. He gets half the profits. I'll get the other half, right? So Franklin is, yes, he's slashing his income by at least a half, like immediately by a half, long-term by a lot more, because of course, if Franklin is actively running this business, it's going to keep growing. But he writes these letters I write about in the book. You can find these letters he writes at this time where he's saying, my time is mine again, right? I have freedom to actually pursue or think things through. And he immediately puts this newfound freedom to effect. The first thing he does is he essentially discovers the major laws of electricity, right? Just because he could just sit and do experiments and think. Like all of this was very new right now. He works out, he coins the term battery, he figures out about voltage and positive and negative, like huge insights, figures out the lightning rod, which was like a massive thing, right? He was like, wait a second. I think lightning is electrical discharge between the ground and the cloud. So we could actually discharge that charge before we have a bolt with a lightning. It works. This is like saving lives. He's like a hero. He gets the Copley Medal in England, right? Then he starts the American Philosophical Society, basically builds the framework for intellectual life in the Americas, then gets into politics. And of course, we know what happens next. Like all of the cool things he did that left a legacy was after he found the way to significantly reduce the amount of things going on. And he was willing to give up. He was like, I have enough money. Right. And that's the way I love the way he thought about it, by the way. Like because he came from nothing, right? He fled an apprenticeship illegally in Boston and made his way down to Philadelphia with nothing in his pocket. Right. So, he thought a lot about money, but the way he thought about it was, how much do I need to be comfortable on? Okay, that's my number. Great. I can get that now. If someone takes this over, I have enough sources of revenue here. I'll be fine. I'll be able to live fine. Now let me focus on what else I want to do. So he was not trying to maximize wealth. He was trying to maximize his ability to do cool things. So I think he's a great exemplar of slow productivity, even though we think of him as Mr. Industrious, checklist, virtue guy. He took a lot off of his plate. And when he did, he started getting things done.
Created freedom for himself to think, right? Morgan Housel and I talked a lot about this recently. I know you and Morgan have talked, another great writer, that he says, sometimes my work is me sitting on the couch thinking for hours, but that doesn't look like work. And sometimes you even feel guilty doing it or just going for a long walk. And it feels like Benjamin Franklin well ahead of his time of saying, I'm going to give up some money in the short term by hiring out this work to create freedom for myself to think, to be reflective, to come up with ideas with no guarantee that that would pay off. And I think that is inspiring to me as, and I'm sure you, when you're working to build whatever you're working to build, of make investments that your future self will thank you for. And I'm betting most people's future self would thank them for creating time freedom. Now, I do think you got to be pretty intentional about how you spend the time. If you do it to watch Netflix or eat bad food and just do nothing,
Yep.
I don't, that's probably not right. But like to create opportunities for you to think and reflect and to work out and to do the things that help generate ideas, that's what I take from this story.
Yeah. So I think it's useful you want to be frustrated before you make a change like this.
Okay.
So you want to start pursuing these other things that are important to you and be frustrated that you don't have enough time. Like you want to be specifically frustrated of like, I'm trying to learn about produce the laws of electricity. I'm trying to get in better shape. I'm trying to write these novels. I really want to do this and I'm trying to do it. And I just don't have enough time because all these other things going on. So like if you have that frustration before you make the simplification, then you're in the right place. If you're not frustrated at all, you're just like, I don't know. Why not? Why not reduce work? Like things are going well, I could automate this, but if you're not frustrated, if there's not stuff you're trying to do and you don't have time to do it, then you run the danger of what you're talking about, where, all right, I hired David Hall. I guess I'm going to start drinking. Like we're like, I don't know what to do with my free time now. Hey, let's check out these pubs in colonial Philadelphia. I haven't had time to see them before. Yeah. So you want to make yourself frustrated and then you want to work to relieve the frustration.
Another person who is a prolific maker of things that I'm a huge fan of, Lin-Manuel Miranda, his musical In the Heights. Okay, I love how deep you went on this and how it was at the beginning when he first wrote it to where it ended up becoming in the process in between. There's another part about him too, about where he wrote Hamilton and the house. That's a separate topic, but I am fascinated by his story as a whole. Can you share more about his initial drafts of In the Heights, a musical, to how long it took to get, I would say, of high quality?
He's a great example. He's going to be a great example of another principle. So if we framework this conversation, right, there's like obsess over quality. We're thinking about Jewel. There's like, don't do too many things. We're thinking about Ben Franklin. Too many things gets in the way of doing anything. Lin-Manuel Miranda and In the Heights is a great example of the third principle, which is working at a more natural pace, right? So if you don't know In the Heights, this was the play that Miranda did before Hamilton. And it was a huge success. It was 7 or 8 Tony Awards, right? Like it was a triumph. We overlook it because Hamilton was such a triumph. We don't realize, but any playwright would be happy with just that first play. Miranda wrote the first version of this play in college at Wesleyan, right? He was a performing arts major. So he had a version of this play done when he was like 20 years old. It was another 8 years after that till the play actually debuted on Broadway, right? So there's this 8 years. So in the book, it's like, let's take this apart. I took apart this story. It was actually kind of hard because Miranda is new enough that it's not like there's definitive biographies written about him yet. So I had to really piece things together from a lot of sources. But here's basically the story that came together. He wrote this play in college, but it wasn't very good because he was 20, right? And 20-year-olds have a hard time writing great plays. But there was a core of some stuff in it that was original, in particular the music, because this is where he debuted that sort of sung through mixture of hip hop with classical Broadway musical numbers that we know from Hamilton. He was experimenting with that even when he was 20. So there was a couple alumni of Wesleyan saw the play. They had a theater production company in Manhattan, and they said, "Look, here's what we're going to do. Let's stage readings. We'll hire actors for the day. We'll stage a reading, and then you can go work on this thing. And when you're ready, come back. We'll stage another reading." And we can kind of keep working on this over time. And so he begins working on crafting this play, but it's over years and he's doing other things. Like his dad, he's a substitute teacher in high school. His dad's like, you got to go to law school, but he ignores his dad. He has a freestyle rap touring group that he's touring the world, like doing freestyle rap performances. He's writing restaurant reviews. So he's got a lot kind of, he's doing different things, but he keeps coming back. All right, let me take another swing at this, and they'll do a performance, and he'll go and just digest that, and like a few months later, let's try this again. So he's just slowly evolving this thing. He's not procrastinating, right? I mean, he's continuing to work on it, but he's not forcing it, right? He's not like, we got to get this done. When I'm 22, this play has to come out. It would have been okay, but probably pretty bad. He's like, I'm going to keep relentlessly working on this, but I'm going to take my time on this until it gets better and better and better. And over the years, it got better and better and better. And finally, it was good enough that it got accepted into this program where it's a program entirely focused on developing your musical play to be ready for the stage. This allowed him to bring on another playwright. She was fantastic. Man, Miranda is great at the music, but he's not great at the book. So they brought on this other playwright who went on to win a Pulitzer of her own for another play. Now it started to really begin to rock and roll. He brought on the musical director who ended up being his director for Hamilton as well. And everything came together finally in this like 1 year period, and the play took off. But it was just this years of him like, I'm going to keep working on this, keep coming back to it, polishing, get some more life experience, try again. So he took his time. He took his time, and eventually that helped him produce something that was fantastic. So I love this principle of slow productivity. It's like, not everything has to be done as fast as possible. Sometimes things take time, and that's okay. Like, it's okay to say, this decade, I want to produce something awesome. And Miranda was like, in my 20s, I want to produce a great play. And it's like a very different way of thinking about productivity than, I want to be super productive on Tuesday. It's just a much wider time scale to think about productivity.
There could be an issue with this paralysis by analysis, though. How do you know when it's time to ship it? How do you know when it's with like a book, for example, your publisher gives you a deadline and you better turn that sucker in, right? I mean, you can extend it sometimes, but for the most part, you know when it's ready because you have a deadline and you better get it ready. But for him, and for others, like, let's relate this to just he's a genius and a savant, right? But maybe didn't start out that way, but worked his way into becoming that. But for the rest of us, how do we know when it's time? How do we know when it's time to ship, as opposed to just constantly analyzing it and then being paralyzed almost by all that analysis?
Yeah, so you have to have stakes in the ground that other people can see.
Yeah.
Right. This turns out to be the solution. So for Miranda, what this was the production company in Manhattan. They're like, great, when are you coming back? In 4 months. Great, we'll put it on the books. We're going to bring in actors, and we're going to read the new version of the play. So he had stakes in the ground where, I have to deliver something new and better. Other people are counting on it. So it's not just, hey, it's up to you. Take as much time as you need. No, you're putting stakes in the ground. You're putting commitments in the ground. What matters is how far out you're spacing those stakes. And he's willing I'm willing to take 3 years of doing this slowly. Another example like that from the book was the Beatles working on Sgt. Pepper, right? Which was it's a key album, not just for them, but in the history of music, because and I get into this in the book, but the big decision the Beatles make before they record that album is no more touring. They were exhausted. They had this sort of tour from hell right before this. This was like 68, I think. This was the tour where the "We're Bigger Than Jesus" quote came out. And also they had all these issues overseas with the Philippines and in Japan. They had to bring out the right. Like, it was just a terrible tour. Like, we're done with touring. But it was a problem because this meant now there was no constraints on their album. If you're a touring band like the Beatles in the 1960s, when you're recording an album, you're recording songs you have to perform on stage. And that like puts a lot of constraints on what you can do. So their very first album after deciding not to tour was kind of a big deal because they could do anything they wanted, which is why Sgt. Pepper has tape delays and unusual Indian instruments on it, and all of these like weird, interesting things you can do in a studio, but you can't do on stage. So they had this the problem of perfectionism, What's to stop them from just spending 4 years working on this album? And what stopped them was they put out a single. It wasn't them. It was actually their manager. As soon as they had something releasable as a single, he put it out. Now there's a stake in the ground. Oh, okay. An album is coming from the Beatles, right? Like, we got to actually deliver this thing pretty soon because our single's already out there. So a stake went in the ground. Now they spent way more time on this album than any previous album, but still a reasonable amount of time. So you could do the same in your own life. You want to put these public stakes in the ground. You can stretch them out. Don't rush yourself, but keep putting them in the ground. If you can't, and this came up, people have been asking me about this since the book came out. Like, well, what if I don't have the ability to do that? There is no production company that wants to stage my reading. There is no publisher who's expecting a draft of my book. There is no single for me to put out. There's no company that's going to release my single. Well, then you want to put your focus on, how do I get better at this to the place where now I can put these stakes in the ground? Like, how do I get good enough at what I'm doing that people care enough that I can actually start putting these stakes in the ground to pull myself forward and producing something, right? And so it's kind of a two-stage process. You got to get good enough at something that people care. And then you have to leverage the fact that people care to hold you accountable, to make you actually deliver, but just give yourself time. Miranda kept having to be accountable, but he did so over a period of 5 or 6 incredibly creatively fertile years. The Beatles spent way more time on Sgt. Pepper than their first album. Their first album they recorded in one day. They came in, they performed the songs, 4-track recording, a couple takes per song, and they were out the door. It was 100 times longer, Sgt. Pepper's, but they still had the stake in the ground. They still had to deliver. So that's what I tell people. It's like, you got to be accountable. And if there's no way to be accountable yet, then maybe you need to turn from your project idea and back towards the fundamental skill building for a bit more.
We're focusing a lot on artists, musicians, inventors, people who make things. There is an overwhelming population of people who have really solid jobs within Fortune 500 companies. A lot of leaders who listen to this, Cal, who have a job exactly like that, right? You're trying to hit the quarter, help the company achieve whatever goals they have set. You haven't set them, the company has. You work within that place. When you think of slow productivity, which a lot of Fortune 500 leaders probably say, I don't want my people reading that book, even though they should. Let's relate this and the thesis and the principles from slow productivity to that person. So I'll build an avatar. A VP of product or a VP of sales at a Fortune 500 company, they're building teams, they have aggressive goals, they have a lot of pressure, they got to hit each quarter, that type of, you worked with people like that. How would you apply the principles from slow productivity to a person like that?
Yeah, and so this is the second of the two audiences for the book, right?
Mm-hmm.
And one of the big claims is the principles we identify by looking at these famous case studies apply equally to entrepreneurs, solopreneurs, people with a lot of autonomy, and people who work within big knowledge work organizations. That the same principles can apply to both. It just looks different. Like, let's take that avatar. What does like working on fewer things, avoiding a logjam look like to that avatar? Well, what it looks like, for example, is having fewer concurrent active projects, right? Not fewer things you work on, not fewer things that you accomplish, but fewer things that you're working on actively. Because the argument there is if you've said yes to, let's say, 10 things, and you're trying to work on all 10 things at the same time, each of those 10 sort of traditional knowledge worker projects has with it its own administrative overhead, right? If I'm actively working on this, there's emails I have to send, there's meetings I have to attend. Just also, you have 10 things you're actively working on at once. All of that administrative overhead is adding up, and it log jams. And soon you find yourself, and I think a lot of knowledge workers are probably shaking their heads in recognition right now. You find yourself in a day in which you have 5 or 6 hours of meetings dotting the day and just frantic emailing in between. And it's very hard to actually make progress on any of these projects. You get a metaphorical logjam, and the rate at which you're finishing good stuff that moves you or your team closer to your quarterly objectives slows down. So let's say instead you say, okay, I've agreed to these 10 things, but I have a clear demarcation. These 3 I'm actively working on, these 7 I'm waiting to work on. And as soon as I finish one of these active things, I'm pulling the next thing in from the waiting list. And I'm making this public. It's a shared document. If you gave me one of these commitments, you can look at it, see exactly where it is. It's number 3 in the waiting list. You can watch it march towards active. As soon as I drag your thing into my active list, I'm going to write you like, I'm working on this actively now. I'm all in on it. Call me anytime. Let's email about it whenever you want. I'm just working on these 3 things at a time. What do you get? A lot less administrative overhead, a lot more of your day free to actually work on what you're working on. Stuff begins to be finished faster. Stuff begins to be finished at a higher level of quality. You're going to hit your marks better, right? Okay, let's look at the Lin-Manuel Miranda. Well, what does this mean if you're like our avatar here working in a big organization? Well, one of the big ideas from that principle is we're not wired to try to work at full intensity 8 hours a day all year round. So what we want to try to get here is more variation in intensity on different time scales. So maybe we want to do something like the technology company Basecamp does with cycling. I'm in an on cycle where I'm focused on a few huge objectives that are really important for the company. And then we have a 2 or 3 week down cycle after that, where we're sort of reflecting on what happened, figuring out what to work on next. We're recharging, we're sort of taking care of details, and then we upcycle again. So maybe we can have more variation in intensity. Maybe I can be more realistic when I give timelines for things. Instead of when someone says, how long is this going to take? Instead of giving them the absolute best case scenario, I give them a much more realistic time frame estimate. So I actually have the breathing room to do it right. And what about Jewel and obsessing over quality? Well, for our avatar, this says, focus on the things, identify the things in your job that really move the needle for your company, and begin to obsess about doing that thing better. Because as you do that thing that really matters better, you're going to gain more leverage in your career, more of what Adam Grant calls idiosyncrasy credits, the ability to say, I don't do meetings in the morning. I like go remote and am disconnected on Monday just to think deeply. I'm moving down to like half time and you're happy to still have me because I really produce results by focusing on what really matters, as opposed to just demonstrating to people that you're very efficient about dealing with emails and meetings. You begin to gain that breathing room that Jewel enjoyed after her career took off. So all 3 of those principles apply to the organizational setup. And in fact, I would say the bulk of the tactical advice in this book is actually aimed at exactly that setup, because that's the setup that I think we need to take the most care to actually figure out how to make slow productivity work.
You mentioned a few minutes ago that we are not wired to work at full intensity 8 hours a day. So agree. What do you think of this idea? Maybe it's easier for you and me. I don't know, because you got to teach, so it's a little different than at a university. But this idea of working like a lion, okay? A lion spends a lot of time resting, sleeping, but when it's time to go and it's time to hunt, they go with maximum effort and intensity. And I try to design my days to work like a lion, where there is time when I must have maximum 100% focus on preparation for talking to Cal Newport, reading his books, watching everything online, doing the actual conversation, recording the intros and outros, but then maybe take a nap or rest and think before the next big thing where I have to go hunt again. Yeah. And so, and I've read about that online, and I really identify with that. What do you think of this idea of working like a lion?
Yeah, I mean, I would say yes, and think about this at multiple time scales.
Yeah.
Right. This is where you really begin to get in sync with our natural rhythms. If you think about having these lion-like variations in intensity at different time scales. So in the course of a day, it might be like you were just talking about, I'm like intensely locked in on doing something. And then after that, I take a nap. Like there's an hour or 2 where I'm doing nothing. We might see this on the course of a week as well. Yeah. Like Friday, I'm really dialing back. Whereas I was, more into things, Monday through Thursday. Then you might, again, zoom out to like the seasonal scale. Like, okay, the summer is going to be a completely different intensity than the fall, right? And all of this we're wired for. I talk about it in the book. I actually go back because I did this long form piece for the New Yorker where I looked at everything we knew about how our Paleolithic ancestors worked, hunting, gathering, etc. And this was one of the big observations. They had these huge variations in energy expenditure on different times of day and weeks. And then, of course, we got the Neolithic Revolution. We have 10, 15,000 years of farming. Well, farming is incredibly seasonal at that larger scale. Like the winter is boring, the fall is incredibly intense. So this is what we're used to. Uh, Now I think we have this fear of like, well, I'm going to produce less if I'm not at full intensity all the time. But the reality is it's impossible to be at full intensity all the time. We're not wired to do that. What we're doing is faking intensity through administrative overhead work. We're faking intensity by doing things like email and chat and meetings that feels like effort, but it's not really that draining. It's draining psychologically, but it doesn't require our full cognitive resources. So we fill a lot of time with this other stuff so that we can give the simulacrum of I'm locked in all the time. I'm at my station on the metaphorical assembly line, turning the crank really fast. But all it's doing is exhausting us. It's not actually producing more.
I enjoyed reading about your process and how your teacher, I believe, when you were getting your PhD, helped you understand this, because you were trying to do like a million different things from what I remember reading, and she helped you understand the importance of focus and why doing all of the different things you were trying to do actually was not helping you.
Yeah, I always wanted to be working on multiple academic papers at the same time because my mindset was if I'm only working on one paper as opposed to like let's say working on three papers, I'm getting a third as much done. Like I can't wait. And she always said, no, just take the thing you want to do, the one paper and obsess about it and just think nothing but about that until it's done. Right.
So limit daily goals. This is the theme of the book that can limit. Sometimes we have too many daily goals, and she helped you understand this importance of limiting those and making that list smaller.
Yeah, and she was right because she is one of the most celebrated and productive computer scientists in computer science, right? But here's why she was right, is because she was seeing the bigger picture. So when you're working on three different big goals in a day, so in my context, like switching back and forth between different papers, you're not getting very much work done on any of them. And in fact, it's not even like you're getting a third as much work done in each. You have this cost of trying to switch your attention from one thing to the other thing. And so when you add up, all right, I worked on three papers per day, and you add that up day by day, it takes three times as long before you get those three papers done because you're just working slower. So it's not actually speeding up in the long term how long it takes you to get these things done. But then there was also the quality hit. So what she realized, because she wrote fantastic papers, again, won all these awards, she realized if like all you're thinking about is one thing, you do it better. So it's not just that, okay, it's the same time, whether you you split your time between three things and take three times longer to finish all three, or just do one thing at a time, one after another. It's not just the time, it's the quality of what you produce goes up when you're just thinking about it. You have more insights. You have in the academic context, you have better proofs and more interesting theorems. You're more likely to write an award caliber paper. So she was right, but I was young and impatient. Like if I was like, I don't have a huge time frame relative to my age. And I was like, I can't just be working on one thing right now. She had the wisdom of years. I was like, look, if you zoom out, those one things are going to finish one after another and produce one great paper after another. And you look back 20 years later, you're going to say, I produced a huge number of great things. You just have to see the long game. So she was absolutely right about that. Limit what you're working on at a time. Do one thing really well, then move on to the next thing. We don't have to be switching back and forth between, 5 or 6. That doesn't make us 5 or 6 times more productive. It makes us less productive.
Obsess over quality and think. This is a prompt I try to ask myself every day. What can I do to make my future self think my current self? What can I do today? Right. And I think working like that, your future self will thank you for it. Right. If you look at what you produce over time and how much of your work will be so good that people can't ignore it, yeah. that is a future self thank you. And I think that some of those simple prompts are helpful. Cal, you open and close the book with a guy named John McPhee. Some people, especially if they're writers, probably know who he is, and some don't. Who is John McPhee, and what did you learn from him about slow productivity?
Well, I mean, John McPhee is one of the most celebrated nonfiction writers of the last 100 years. So his home has been the New Yorker, So I like to call him my colleague at the New Yorker. Though, that's sort of like the bat boy at the Yankees being like, well, here's my colleague Aaron Judge. But anyways, he's been a New Yorker writer since the 1960s. Um, Writes these long form pieces, often on like narrow and esoteric topics, and then he makes it fascinating. Like one of his early big famous New Yorker articles was on the history of the orange, right? So that's peak John McPhee. Won a Pulitzer, been finalist for the National Book Awards, teaches this creative nonfiction writing class at Princeton that has turned out now two different generations of nonfiction writing leaders. So you were talking about like David Rimnick and John Krakauer took this course, but so did Tim Ferriss in like a younger generation. My generation took this course. Jennifer Weiner took this course, like this sort of famous course. Anyways, I opened the book on him because I say I'm going to zoom in on a particular week in the life of John McPhee in the 1960s. He's working on a big New Yorker piece on the Pine Barrens. And we know about this from a writing memoir he wrote called Draft Number 4. In this week, what was he doing? He was lying on his back at a picnic table in his backyard in Princeton, New Jersey, just trying to figure out, how am I going to make this article work? Like that's all he did for a week. And he writes about this in great detail. My argument was, look, if you zoom in on that week, by modern standards of knowledge or productivity, we'd say, look at this lazy guy. How is he? He's not, there's no emails being sent. There's no meetings attending. He's not posting things on social media. He doesn't have 5 projects. He's just laying on his back doing almost anything. So when we zoom in, he looks lazy and unproductive. But when we zoom out, there's no way to describe John McPhee except for incredibly productive, right? 26 books, this storied career at the New Yorker, one of the most influential writers, in the history of nonfiction writing. He's an incredibly productive person by any reasonable definition of the term. And yet when we zoom in on a day in his life or a week in his life, we see someone not doing very much. And so that was like the quintessential slow productivity. That was in some sense the inspiration for the book. This idea that in the short term, it can be looking like you're doing very little. You're very slow and deliberate. And yet when you zoom out, people say, I'm so impressed by all you had to do. So I open and close with John McPhee because I think he crystallizes this idea of slow productivity, that slowing down, doing things great at a natural pace in the short term might be disconcerting, but in the long term can actually be incredibly productive.
You care about high quality, you care about greatness, you obsess over that. Yes, sometimes if you look at somebody in the short term, like, what is he doing or what is she doing? But then if you're playing the long game, they're the ones who are actually the most productive because they're not hyper, they're not guarding their desk, they're not doing the things that are the busy work, right? They are past the need for approval from society, knowing that this is the way. When I first saw the book and it was sent to me, I love the cover, by the way. It's a little different than what you normally do. It's this beautiful picture, like out in nature. It looks like, oh, I want to go hike out there and hang out in that cabin that Cal put on his book. But this idea of slow productivity, and when I saw the title initially, I was like, I don't know. But then I dig into it, and I thought, this is it. If you actually want to be productive, this is a guide on how to do that. So I'm very grateful that you decided to write this book, Cal. It's called Slow Productivity: The Lost Art of Accomplishment Without Burnout. Now that you're past some of the promotion time, how are you feeling about it?
I'm happy it's out there.
Yeah.
It was, man, book publishing is more stressful these days.
Yeah.
that it used to be. Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, this book got out there and definitely drew attention, good and bad, which I guess is sort of the price you pay to be out there. But now I'm at the phase I like, where the book has been out long enough that people have read it and they can start sending me notes about, I did this, or here's an example of this. This resonated with me. Hey, do you know about this person? I think they're a great example about it. I love that period about a month after a book comes out when I can begin to hear from readers about their experiences with the book. It could also be a frustrating experience because what happens is people send you in just the best possible examples. Like, oh, I love this chapter. Did you know about, and it's just the perfect example. So it's always like a month after the book comes out, you say, oh man, I could have rewritten almost every chapter with like new examples. But I love it. I'm starting to hear from the readers. I'm hearing all the ways people are resonating with the advice, their situations, how they're applying it. So now finally we get to the fun part.
It's like that old adage. They say, hey, do you want to find a typo in your blog post? Just hit publish. You'll find it. Right? Same thing with a book. You want to find some better ideas or stories that bring them to life? Just publish the book. You'll get them. You'll get them. It's always the way it works. Tal, this is amazing, man. I appreciate, again, your work. I've been following it for a long time now, and I absolutely want to continue our dialogue as we both progress, man.
All right, let's do it. I'll keep writing books so we can keep talking because I need more t-shirts. I need more t-shirts. So
I'm going to get your address after we get done recording here, and I will send you a new one right away. I promise. So thank you, man.